Number 1. I grew up involved with the Quiverful movement, a type of Christian fundamentalism that involves having a bunch of children home educated. Extremely modest dress included head coverings, the practice of courting, and betrothals, which is basically semi-arranged marriages that take place as soon as the girl was old enough to marry, and something called Christian patriarchy, wherein the father is viewed as some sort of mini-god. I grew up attending a small Christian school run by the local independent fundamentalist Baptist church, where every student was quiverful. We were required to wear extremely modest clothing, ankle-length skirts, hemlines that covered the base of our necks, and we had wardrobe checks multiple times a day to ensure that this strict code was adhered to at all times. Each morning, we would pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Bible. It's been years, but I can still recite both pledges by heart. Then we recited the chapters of the Bible that we were working on. Yes, I did say chapters. We memorized several books of the Bible and had to know them in their entirety. Our schoolwork was primarily books published by Abeka, BJU Press, and ACE. Our textbooks claimed that no transitional fossils had ever been found, that the Loch Ness Monster had been proven to be real and was a plesiosaur. The Great Depression had never happened, but was just a myth made up by socialists, that slavery was a win-win situation for all involved, that dinosaurs breathed fire, and that the KKK were great dudes who got a bad rap. The Trail of Tears were actually super great, and outer space wasn't real, because if you blew on a pile of baby powder, a new planet wouldn't form. This was demonstrated. The liberals didn't believe in personal responsibility. The world is about to be attacked by the floating space Jerusalem. We never covered much actual maths, science, etc. And learning the truth about the government's plan to start a second Holocaust on the Christians was seen as much more important. For 1 year, the girls also took Christian Charm. This was primarily about how God really cares about whether your chest is 10 inches larger than your waist or not. Girls were forbidden from standing with their feet parallel, like a man's. Instead, having to keep our feet at ridiculous and painful angles. We couldn't walk without being careful to glide gracefully and avoid swishing our knees. We were forbidden to not smile, but our smiles were never big enough, or they were too big. There wasn't much time for real schoolwork anyway, since we were all so busy being punished for having an ungodly facial expression, and forced to spend the rest of the school day standing on our tiptoes on one foot in the corner. In 4th grade, my parents chose to pull me out and homeschool me. We joined a local homeschool group filled with quiverful homeschoolers. My parents had gone to a different church, one which was very charismatic. We spoke in tongues, exorcised people, healed with prayer, but not necessarily quite so extreme as the IFB I had been sent to. However, as my father became more violent, as he had a lot of mental issues and was an extreme hoarder, my mother, who was a borderline hoarder and very depressive, so much so that the first 10 years of my life she barely left her bed except to use the washroom, became more and more heavily sucked into this subculture. My parents had already gotten rid of most TV channels over concerns about evil spirits and only allowed us to read a few classic books. But after this, my mum stopped allowing us to read anything non-Christian, then banned novels altogether. We began being forbidden to see anyone who did not go to our church or homeschool group, since my parents never really started teaching, and I had little access to books, and at the time no internet. So this left little to do all day, aside from copy our Bible verses and stare out the window for hours. Time sort of stopped meaning anything. We became more into the Bible patriarchy thing, where my father was seen as the head of the household, and sort of a direct representative from God, who women were to serve and obey in every way. You weren't supposed to express any kind of wish or desire, but leave it up to your husband or father to make every decision for you. If you were his daughter, this included selecting your husband, and girls were expected to be stay-at-home daughters, serving their fathers until marriage. Biblical femininity was emphasized, which in this case meant long skirts and not having opinions or desires, except to serve whatever man God chose at the best helpmeet possible. For a couple of years, my mum, who was herself a nurse, stopped allowing us to take medicine, believing it to be witchcraft. She became more and more crazed about the idea of demons trying to attack her and our family. Unfortunately, I was born with a birthmark on my leg, and she believed that this made me Satan. My father and mother both searched for ways to fix this. I have been exorcised, had oil poured over me, had everything I own incinerated, and it apparently didn't work. After my father died, we were at least spared from his extreme violence, but my mother became only more unhinged and depressed. She mostly gave up on the idea of me being Satan, but became absolutely obsessed with the idea of Satan attacking our family. This belief is reinforced by our church and the charismatic material that she read. She even abandoned our homeschool group, believing it to be not concerned enough about how demons are possessing everyone. Our church was obsessed with spiritual attacks, which is seen as streaming from absolutely everything. Anne of Green Gables, witchcraft. Christian music, actually sung by Satanists, filled with subliminal satanic messages. Cabbage Patch Dolls, demons, who stay still until we look at them. I'm 100% serious. The only way to ward off this is to speak in tongues, make prophecies, yada yada. A few people in my church believe they hear the voices of demons in their heads, and said demons are chasing them. I've been there as well, and we've all laid hands on people and prayed for them to be liberated from the demonic oppression in their lives. I don't really have an end to the story. I still live with my mother and sister, and still go months without seeing anyone who isn't from church. I have no real education, although, since I now have access to the internet, it's monitored. But my mother doesn't know about incognito mode, so I can secretly read Homeschoolers Anonymous, No Longer Quivering, and things about atheism on Reddit. I've been trying to learn some math through the Khan Academy, and I hope to eventually escape, even if I have no idea just how yet. Number 2. I grew up in this church that was okay. I was just bullied a little, but eventually they started running out of money and went under. So instead of being rational and finding a new church, my mother decided to have me and my brother study the Bible her way. Secular music was trying to infest our minds and make us impure. Harry Potter was witchcraft, and if I read the books, I would go to hell. My mother even went as far as coming to school, yelling at my teacher for reading Harry Potter to us, and leaving me to be sent to the office instead. Yes, we were lucky enough to go to a public school, while I was also unfortunately bullied. But after, we got homeschooled, and we'd have to sit and write in these notebooks about God's plan for us, and how, if anything went wrong, it would be our fault, even if I was just treated differently, because my parents were, psychotic. So if I had a bad day at school because people made fun of me, I had to sit at the table until I thought about which sin I had done, which is why I received that righteous punishment. My brother, on the other hand, never had to do those things because he was male, and of course God wanted to bless him, since Eve was the fall of man. It was my place to take the blame. The same thing came time and time again as I was growing up. My brother was always encouraged to be social and join church events. I don't hold him against it. He faced some bullying too. But I was punished for expressing interests in Girl Scouts because they were a cult. Yeah, like our church wasn't. So, when I was in 4th grade, I was the victim of sexual abuse by 2 of my neighbors. I never told anyone. The whole time I was trying to recover from this, I was told that any impurity, especially sexual impurity, means that you are going to burn in hell forever, and that gays and lesbians are the spawn of Satan. Bear in mind, one of the people who molested me was a female. This was obviously traumatic enough, but as soon as my father started to become physically abusive, because he lost his job, we received slaps across the face, chairs and scissors thrown, and other instances, such as being told that I'd be skinned alive if I was caught doing wrong. It was terrifying. My brother was quick to point a finger at me for many things, but I understand now that it was all in self-defense. We were also grossly underweight. We had to earn dinner, and having to pretend was tiring, as my best friend's mum was suspicious because she saw my father push me down the stairs and flip my brother over the railing, all the while being told if we did things wrong, it was because we weren't Christian enough, and if it wasn't inflicted by them, it was God's plan for me. The summer going into 5th grade, they sent me to some camp, and we were swimming, and I decided I'd rather drown than go home. But I ended up throwing up the water and safely back home. I was scared and wanted to leave, so I told my mum I tried to commit suicide. Mind you, I couldn't even spell the word correctly, only to be told that demons took possession of my body and that I was ill. I asked if the doctor could fix me, and she told me that I would be disowned and sent to a psychotic ward with scary people, and I'd probably be attacked by them. She also told me that if I had depression, which is from Satan, she'd give me a reason to be depressed because I had a great life. So I pretended to agree. I faked it until I was 16. Then one day, my father got mad at me. Not the usual yell and smack a few times, but mad enough to lose it. I'm very into rock and metal and that type of stuff, but I hid it from them. The first time they made me burn my possessions, but eventually he found a lost shirt with a skull on it that I changed after I left home, and he claimed that it never happened, but he started chasing with me with the intent to hurt me, and from what I could assess, I had to run. So I tried to call CPS, and he threw the phone away, grabbing me by the skin of my shoulders and said he would kill me. I screamed, and he said to shut up and strangled me, eventually realizing it wasn't a good idea to choke his child, and dropped me, and I ran into my room. It took a few years for it to manifest, as I'm 18 now, but his actions caused my spine to herniate in several places, and one day I woke up unable to move my hands, and now I have chronic pain issues, but I'm dependent on them for medical expenses. I won't forgive that, but my father was eventually diagnosed with bipolar, and now takes medicine for that, but it doesn't excuse his actions. I'm no longer facing physical abuse, and thank God, pun intended, that I'm in college now. So, not exactly a cult, but kind of like a family cult, because my brother is like them now, and I'm still afraid to say anything against their faith, because my medical expenses will definitely be cut off. I'm kind of in a sticky situation, and I have no idea what to do or where to go from here. Number 3. I was born into the Worldwide Church of God. It was started by an insurance salesman in the 1930s, maybe late 1920s, over the radio. Herbert W. Armstrong, our pastor general, at its peak, was literally worldwide. Headquarters were in Pasadena, California, and our dear pastor general had a private plane and statues made of gold, while most of the congregation lived in poverty. A tithing of 20% was mandatory. For those of you who don't know, it's like an optional tax. They make you pay 20%. They make you want to contribute. Because if you don't take the faith seriously. And that has extreme negative stigmatization within the community that you're in. Every third year, it was 30%. It was a mixture of Jehovah's Witness with whatever controlled the masses mixed in. Pure Old Testament. We kept the Sabbath from Friday night sundown until Saturday night sundown. No Christmas, no Easter. We kept the true holy days. The Feast of the Tabernacles, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, etc. We were the chosen ones, of course. It was very sexist and racist. A lot of alcoholism went on, as well as abuse, and the men, as always, were the head of the household, and it drew a lot of people in poverty in. Luckily, my parents were some of the more liberal types, who didn't believe that getting wasted and abusing their children was the will of God, so I didn't have it as bad as many others. We were also, quote, rich, which meant we weren't living in poverty. In the mid-1990s, it split up due to a change in doctrine and is now a shell of what it used to be, due to the many splinter groups. They all believe in pretty much the same thing, except who should be in power. Luckily for me, my whole family left in the late 90s and are all agnostic or dislike organized religion. Women's were Jezebels with no brain and couldn't be trusted. Men were to rule with an iron fist, whilst drunk, but no one talked about that. Involvement with outsiders was strongly discouraged, and if you married someone from outside the church, you ran the risk of being disfellowshipped. If a woman wanted to leave her abusive husband, she was told to just do what she had to do or accept the punishment. Medicine was also discouraged along with vaccines. The end times were predicted many times, and our place of safety was Petra, Jordan. I could go on about the tragedies that went on in the name of God, but it was all pretty much the same as any super conservative extreme Christian church. Thank the universe I got out at 19 along with my family. Others were not so lucky. My story and I got out. I now have a great life, but still feel a little bitter towards the church. Though I am well aware it could have gone much worse. I thank my parents for being sane in an insane church. Number 4. I got out. Since there seems to be such a growing concern about cult involvement, I would like to share my disappointing 2-year experience in a very harmful group to which I once belonged. My hunger for spiritual truth began when I was very young, in grade school, and my biggest questions were, am I going to heaven? And is there a hell? How can I be sure it'll be heaven I go to when I die? What do I have to do to get to heaven? It was not until high school that I heard, through close friends, about a training school that I could go to, which taught people how to become so-called men of God. After that time, the person became an ordained clergyman, a man of God, who took the place of Christ himself here on earth. For each of these spiritually anointed men, heaven was a sure guarantee. This was for me. Furthermore, after the training period, each of these men was guaranteed a position in this organization and was supported by its followers. Most of them were given a car and a house, and a group of people, followers of this sect, over which to be the leader. I got in touch with one of the group's leaders for advice on how to get into the training school, and he said that this school was an all-male school and that marriage or even dating was not allowed whilst in the school. And he also said that there were certain rules I would have to follow to make sure it was what I wanted. But, he said, if God is calling you, then you should do as he says. Perhaps this is his will for your life. And I believed it was. Upon my arrival at the training school, located in the hills of eastern Kentucky, well, the first thing I noticed was that everyone was dressed in black. After I registered, I was taken to the place where I would be living. There were no separate rooms. Instead, there was one big open dormitory. On the third floor, where about 100 of the members slept. Each of us had a small closet locker on the first floor, in which to keep the things that we owned. The buildings were quite run down, and after I got settled in, I began to find out more about this group from the inside, and was disappointed in many ways. Everyone had to be in bed at 10 o'clock, every night. On weekends, we were allowed to stay up until 11. There were no exceptions. We were greeted every morning by a loud buzzer, and we were required to immediately get out of bed and get dressed into our attire for the day. This consisted of a black robe with a belt over regular clothing and black shoes, and was worn all day. Daily at 5:30 a.m, we were required to be in the main building, with ritualistic prayers, chants, and special services were said by one of the leaders. This became very boring and routine, because there never was a change. It was the exact same thing every morning of the week. We were continually watched by our peers, and were punished and sharply reproved if we were not at these functions. We were never allowed to go anywhere outside the grounds at night for anything. Seldom were we allowed to go into the nearby town at all. When we did, we had to state on paper exactly where we were going, why we were going, and the time that we would return. None of us were allowed to be out over 2 hours. We were not allowed to talk to anyone in town unless it was absolutely necessary, especially those of the opposite sex. One day, a friend and I stopped to talk to some girls we met at a store, and we were seen by someone from the school. When we returned home, we immediately got called to the office of the top leader of the school, and were accused of compromising our commitment to God. If this happens again, we would not be allowed to go to town anymore. This incident planted the first seed of doubt in my mind about this group. Something was wrong with the whole scene. The next lingering disappointment came as I sat in the doctrinal classes that were taught night after night. I was looking for God at first, but after a while I was so mentally confused with this group's doctrine that I even began to question if there was a God. If he was so loving, why must I go through all this discipline and confusion? In one of our classes, we would listen to rock or popular music, such as the Beatles or Simon and Garfunkel. Afterwards, we would have a philosophical discussion to try and interpret what the message was behind the lyrics of the song. and what the writer was saying. In my entire 2 years of involvement in this so-called Christian sect, I never saw a Bible and never read one. When we had problems, there were certain men who were counselors that we could go to for advice. One of these men used hypnotism as his method. Because of the size of this religious sect, I never got a chance to personally meet the top leader of the organization who lives in another country. I heard a lot about him from our teachers. It seems this holy man was chosen by God to be the #1 representative of Jesus Christ in the whole world, and that what claims to be the only one true church today, and that anyone outside it is in danger of eternal hellfire and death. If members do not live according to the standards and doctrines set by the supreme leader of the organization, they are considered in sin and eligible for hell. Sin conscientiousness and guilt are two biggest tools used to keep the members involved in the sect. I felt required to give 10% of all my income to the organization because of fear of sin and guilt if I didn't do so. After about a year and a half at this training school, I found out that there was even more corruption going on within. Some of the group leaders were gay and had such relationships with some of the students. There were also homosexual orgies that took place. One of the elders at the school began to make advances at me. He was only 2 years away from being ordained as a clergyman and a man of God who was supposed to help others. When I reported this, he was transferred. It was after finding out of these things that I decided to leave the organization. When I talked with one of the counselors at the school about leaving, he said that if God called me here, I was turning my back on God's calling for my life. When I left, I completely rejected anything the group stood for. To this day, according to their doctrines, I am heading for eternal hellfire unless I come back and repent. It was not until 7 years later when I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Saviour and Lord and began studying God's Word that my spiritual hunger was satisfied. Soon I realized that God's Word alone holds the truth that one should follow. His Word is my calling and guide, and only His Word separates the truth from error. Or at least, that's how I see it. Number 5. This is my story, but it still messed with my head and soured my view of conservative Christianity. When I was a sophomore in college, I had a lot of family drama at home, so I moved 1,200 miles away to get away from all of that. That brought me from Minnesota to the rural South. I had grown up in a very liberal ELCA Lutheran church, LGBT supportive, female pastors, and mostly Democrats, the complete opposite of where I ended up. Since I was far from home with no family, and I was very poor, there was this campus religious organization at my new university that gave out free food 2 or 3 times a week. It was because of them that I was able to eat at all some days. At first, I was love-bombed, showered with attention, and offered to sober parties and people who would help me with laundry and finding rides. I had no car, you see. While I spent most of my time at this building's group right off campus, I still managed to retain a few friends. If I ever mentioned them at the youth group, the other members were constantly suspicious. Members were encouraged to minister to the lost souls on campus, but were met with disapproving eyes when they were involved with any other organizations. They were kind of like a sorority in the way that they were encouraged to advertise their club at all times. You were expected to donate money to every student's mission trip, fundraiser, or risk being thought of as a lukewarm Christian. I became especially close to one regular guy, a friend of my neighbors, who came to visit the group on one of their food nights. He accidentally swore once, and from then on, the entire group hated him. One of my female friends confronted me about this ungodly relationship that can turn into uncontrollable lust if I'm around him unsupervised. When he moved away, I fell into a pretty severe depression. I was told God separated us so that I can be free of bad influences. This was their main message. Once a month or so, there'd be a Bible study group just for girls. We rarely studied the Bible at all. Mostly, one or two of the upperclassmen would lecture us about how we aren't to have a heart-to-heart conversation with men before we're married. Keep it to small talk and group conversation until the guy has proposed. Otherwise, Satan can use lust to control your thoughts. Boys and girls were never to be alone in pair. This led to most girls getting married to the men they've known for a couple of months in order to have sex, or even to have real conversations. Who knows? Ironically, the songs they sung sounded incredibly pornographic. Feeling his love raining down on my face? This wasn't their only screwed up belief. Mental illness was another thing that was looked down upon by the group as a spiritual flaw. I was once told that my anxiety disorder was caused by demons rather than a brain imbalance. My Bible study leader believed poor people were poor because they weren't spiritual enough, and she regularly said so. They instructed the students to pretend to be friends with lonely people on campus, just long enough to get them to church. I had moved away and transferred schools again in order to be away from the influence of this group. In a small college town that didn't have very good transportation, where the majority of the students fled home every weekend, I wasn't able to be independent without their help. I still visit close by sometimes, but I try to keep my distance away from any of my old church acquaintances. I'm doing better now, but I'm still a bit paranoid. This guy that got so much undeserved hatred from them recently came back into my life, and now we're together. Once gossip travels and these people find out, I'm fully anticipating a surprise intervention / exorcism / Bible thrown at me as a weapon like the movie Saved. Number 6. About 2 years ago, my friends and I had found out about an abandoned insane asylum located in Downey, California. Being the curious 17-year-olds that we were, we decided it would be a good idea to explore this abandoned facility, just to see what we could find inside. So on a Saturday night, we gathered a few more of our friends and made the drive out to Downey, so that we could explore this building for ourselves. After about 30 minutes of driving, we arrive in Downey and make our way through the city to where the asylum was located. The closer we get, the shadier and shadier the neighborhoods that we were passing through became, and after another 15 minutes or so of driving, we arrive to our destination. We park the car, climb through the hole in the fence, and make our way into the building to see what we could find. To be honest, it started out not being too bad, considering we had about 10 people. We were thinking, what's the worst that could happen to a group of 10 people? So we meander through the building, looking at all the broken furniture scattered throughout the rooms. The patient files were thrown up on the floor, and we're pretty much having a great time looking through this abandoned mental institution. But this is where shit gets weird. As we were walking, we of course had a flashlight pointed down the hallway, because the power that once was in the building was and is clearly out. But as we're walking with our flashlights pointing ahead of us, we come to a corner and see the adjacent wall of the corridor light up from what we assumed was another flashlight. And sure enough, we turn the corner and there's another group of 4 kids, shady as hell. We confronted each other, and they ask us if we'd been to the slide. We politely answer no, because we have no idea what they're talking about, and they tell us that we should follow them. Of course, we decline because we're getting weird vibes from these people, and they're talking amongst themselves. One of the kid comes up with me, I kid you not, with a 6-inch long Bowie knife. Isn't this thing cool? Look what I found, as he moves the knife closer to my face. I politely answer, what a cool thing to find, and we start moving away, telling them that we're going to explore the roof of the building. Surprisingly, they say you're right, and they turn the corner and continue on their way. Alright, now that they're out of the way, I'm seriously beginning to feel weird about being in this place, and about how we're definitely not supposed to be here. So at this point I say screw it, we need to go to the roof, go down the fire escape and get out of here. So we make our way to the roof, and we're sitting there plotting our escape. Like I said, people are not supposed to be in the asylum, so they have a police car stationed at the main gate to make sure that no one comes in. So, as we're up there, we try and figure out the best path to get out of here without getting noticed by the cops. That's when my friend sees a fire escape ladder coming down off this higher portion of the roof. We decide that that is probably our best bet, so we grab a small ladder that we will be able to boost from this higher portion of the roof, and my friend Jonah goes up and immediately turns, so he could help other people by pulling them down. As I'm getting myself up there, my heart completely sinks. Jonah, did you not see this when you got up here? What the hell are you talking about, man? He responds. I'm looking forward, and he slowly turns to see what is pretty much my worst nightmare. There are about 15 hooded people, sitting in a circle up there, surrounding a burning cat or some other dead animal. These guys are speaking in tongues and making noises which sounded satanic. As we're both getting down, we get noticed, and they start talking amongst themselves in this weird language. And as soon as we get down, these guys stand up and start sprinting towards us. I tell everyone to ditch the idea of the fire escape and not to worry about the cop. We need to get the hell out of there. So we start sprinting through the building with this cult in close pursuit behind us. We miraculously make it out of the building and are starting to run across the field to the main gate. And as we're doing so, the cop notices all the commotions and turns on his sirens and comes driving in. Thank God he manages to cut off the cult from us, and he starts chasing them as we get away safely. Honestly, I can safely say it was the scariest experience of my life. Why would we have done that? What would we have done if they'd have taken one of our friends? Would we have gone back in to confront them? I don't know. I'm just glad it didn't happen. Number 7. I was raised in an extremist Pentecostal cult. My uncle had molested a 16-year-old girl and was kicked out of their organization. So he branched off and created his own religion, and my family followed. I was unable to listen to music, wear pants or makeup, hang out with my friends, and was forced to work and start paying rent when I was only 14. I wasn't allowed to use the family toothpaste. I had to buy my own. Women were treated like shit, and none of the men worked. They stayed at home and had affairs. I'll give you an example to kind of show you how crazy these people were and are. I broke my finger at school, and my parents didn't take me to hospital. They instead took me to church and tried to heal it with faith. When my finger remained crooked, they started screaming at me for having a demon which was preventing me from having the faith heal my finger. They then exorcised the demons out of me. I've had the demons exorcised out of me more times than I can remember, for trivial things. I was emotionally and physically abused, as well as manipulated in every sense of the word. When I was sexually abused by a Sunday school teacher's husband when I was 4 and told my family about it, They yelled at me for wanting to tell others about it in hopes of protecting other children from the same fate. They were terrible, disgusting people. I could tell you even more stories that would cause you to lose your faith in humanity. My finger is permanently crooked, and it's a reminder of where I came from. A few months before my high school graduation, I had gone to another city for a Christian youth convention, which is kind of in itself a miracle that I was actually allowed to attend, since it was a non-denominational event. I had stupidly agreed to meet a boy that I had been talking to online, and we kind of hit it off. This would have been April. Afterwards, him and I kind of secretly kept in contact, and then my parents found out that I was talking to a boy online and forced me to cease all communications further with him. So I sent him a message whilst my parents dictated over my shoulder, saying I was never going to talk to him again. He basically figured out that something was up, and ended up driving from his city to mine, which is a 10-hour drive, to come see me and hear it from me in person. He stayed in a campsite 10 minutes out of town, and I snuck away to see him, and we went for a walk around the campsite to talk about what was going on. Somehow, my family got wind of it, and when we got back to his tent, they had somehow found him and went through all his belongings. They found condoms, so called the police and said that I was raped. I'll never forget walking up the road seeing several vehicles, including cop cars as well as half my church. My father was driving around with a shotgun trying to find us. I tried talking things down with the cops, whilst my relatives screamed at him. I wasn't raped, I was a virgin. The cops told me that I should go home and straighten things out with my family, and then come back and talk to the boy. So I did that. When I got home, there were more members of the church already at my house. They physically restrained me in the basement and exorcised demons of lust and whatever else out of me. They told me I was moving to my grandmother's house on the other side of the country while they find a missionary placement for me. I would go to Ghana and then come back and marry a man from the church and start my own church with him, and I had zero to say in the matter. So, I took off in the middle of the night and had the boy meet me at the town's water tower. I left a note with my brother. I was in my pajamas and it was storming outside. Sounds so much like a corny movie, but it's true. He took me out of there and we went to pack up his tent, and my mum showed up, thinking that if she came alone she could talk me out of leaving. This was the hardest moment of my life. She had been my best friend for such a long time, and I knew what my leaving meant for her. I sat in the passenger seat of his car, whilst my mum sat on the ground and clutched my arm, pleading for me to stay. It was dark, raining and cold, and I had to stare ahead and pretend I didn't care that she was hurting, and turned off a lot of emotions that night. I said goodbye and cried silently the entire trip back to his city. As far as I know, all the members of the church are still practicing, but a lot of them have split up into different parts of the country. Generally, they will stay in a town and move when people start finding out what goes on behind the scenes. Number 8. Cults. I had bad experience with cults. When I was 15, I was sent to live with one as punishment for smoking marijuana and dyeing my hair black. My parents are actually pretty normal for Midwestern US Christians. I was sent to this cult in South Texas to get my heart right with God, or some such nonsense. There was a classic compound that had their own church, their own housing for members, which was trailers, a dining hall, a school building, and a post office run by the cult, with an old lady who would take mail and take it to the real post office, as well as a garden, which was several acres and more like a small farm, and 6 huge dorms spaced apart on the huge compound, one for each age group and gender. where people would be tricked into coming if they were over 18 and forced to stay, and if they were under 18, were marketed as residential facilities for troubled teens. So parents would sign over their kids indefinitely. The paperwork parents signed was very thoroughly written by attorneys to punish parents financially if they tried to get their kids back before they'd been there for a whole year. Here are a few rules and practices. Diet and food were totally controlled by cult leaders. No external stimuli of any kind allowed. Books, films, music, news, clothing, jewelry, personal items such as mementos, correspondence containing news of the outside world, photos except of immediate family members, as long as family not attired in worldly clothing. No talking, ever, and no singing, except at group in church. No drawing or writing, except one letter to parents per week, during the 30-minute schedule to do every Sunday afternoon. No napping. No showering, except during designated times. No doing anything unscheduled. Sleep deprivation was routine and systematic. We were awoken at 4:30, and sometimes 5, to read the Bible and then pray on our knees and faces. Giving meaningless tasks on a daily basis, just to test obedience and have an excuse to arbitrarily punish those who didn't like or feel like they were assimilating well enough. We were never given adequate time or supplies to complete tasks either. Control of personal hygiene, including which shampoos and soaps were allowed to be used when or if we were allowed to shower, and we were not allowed to shave our legs. Even electric shavers were taken. And shaving was used as a reward to girls who met approval, and we were not allowed to pluck our eyebrows as it was seen as worldly. We were not allowed to use restrooms as needed, even to change sanitary napkins whilst menstruating. I saw quite a few girls with blood running down their legs on a regular basis, and we were not allowed to choose which sanitary products were used. No tampons, only pads. Punishment consisted of public and degrading treatment, including public torture such as extended use of stress positions and forcing girls to exercise until they passed out. Corporal punishment, witnessed by the male head of the dorm, among others, public humiliation, taking away clothing and being forced to wear a uniform which signified punishment, standing in place for 20 hours a day, even whilst eating, and only being allowed to sleep 4 hours a night, was one punishment which could go on indefinitely. Constantly changing and arbitrary rules designed to interfere with the smallest and most mundane aspects of life, and also degrade and erode a girl's sense of autonomy and dignity. I don't remember half of the stupid rules there, but one example was we are not allowed to hang towels over the shower curtain rod. Since there were no hooks or towel rods, we had to hang our wet towels on hangers in the closet up against our clothes. Forced attendance and participation in church services every Wednesday, Saturday, and twice a week on Sunday. Forced participation in choir. Forced participation in testimony, where any girl could be called to stand up and recount what a terrible person she'd been and how Jesus had saved her soul as well. And if you only told the truth, they'd accuse you of lying and you'd be punished. You had to embellish and exaggerate everything. From an urban area? Congrats, you're in a gang. Premarital sex with a boyfriend? You're a prostitute. Smoked pot? You must mean you shot heroin. Short hair? Lesbian. Black hair? Satan worshipper. Now, cry for everyone to see how sorry you are that you were so wicked. Cry to thank Jesus for all he's done for bringing you here. Cry for your life and soul. Make me believe you. That is how they made you feel. It was horrific. Taped sermons of the cult leaders' long-dead founders were played at night at full volume, if they thought that there was an evil spirit in the dorm or such nonsense. When I arrived, they played the sermons for a week straight. If a girl was not being contrite or obedient enough, they would restrain her, without her having to do anything to initiate it, and beat her with a paddle. for her own good and get that sin out of her. The leader of the dorm would get us all together and scream at us, act like he was drop-kicking something in a pantomime, whilst implying that he would do that to any of us. Say he knew exactly what he could get away with, legally, and sometimes he would be roused out of bed in the middle of the night for these screaming sessions which were called sermons. We were allowed one 15-minute phone call per month with parents. If parents forgot to call or called too late, too bad. A staff member listens in and monitors communications. If anything suspect is said, the call will immediately be terminated. Letters may only be sent to immediate family, and all communication is to be read by staff and must be approved before being mailed. Only letters from immediate family may be received, and all incoming communication is read by staff and must be approved before being delivered to the recipient. Items may be redacted with a black Sharpie before being read by the recipient, or the entire letter may be thrown in the trash without notifying either the sender or the recipient of the decision to do so, or of the existence of the letter, as well as general unpredictability. I was there for just over 10 months, and afterwards was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The place got shut down just after I left. It moved to Florida and got shut down there, and is now open in Missouri. None of these 3 states require licensing or oversight from the state for these residential facilities to operate, because they are affiliated with the church and qualify for faith-based exemptions. My dad died unexpectedly whilst I was there. My mum alternated between trying to justify/gloss over it, basically saying it was my fault and that I made it necessary, and that their hearts were in the right place, or a combination of the two. Or, on a couple of occasions, she actually apologized. One of those times she was pretty sincere, and I stopped bringing it up. You see, they knew the place was strict. They bought into the tough love hype from James Dobson, which had prepared them mentally to be able to do this. When my mum and I arrived there, I knew it wasn't a place I wanted to be. I can't even explain the sense of panic. I freaked out, which my mum took to mean that I needed to be there even more than she thought, and further solidified the decision to leave me there. Once I was in, I couldn't tell them what was going on, because of the meticulous communications monitoring. I did tell my mum after she came to visit me after I'd been there for 6 months, but she wouldn't listen. I try not to think about it now. It's just what religion does to people. She thought God wanted me to be there, and that there was some higher purpose going on that we didn't understand. Also, it was probably a lot easier on her to have me gone. I only got out when the cult kicked me out. Number 9. I wasn't in a cult, but the mother of the girl I work with was in one. She sent my co-worker to this summer camp hosted by a cult. So, she gets there, and for the first few days all the girls were just like, yeah, right, like, I'm just gonna believe this nonsense. She told me they did a lot of one-to-one counselling, which managed to convert a few of the girls. They then used these girls to manipulate others, doing things like belittling the non-believers and trying to shun them from the group. I remember she said they were only allowed to call their family in emergency situations, so I guess they were trying to separate them from any emotional or moral support that they could break easier. My co-worker managed to sneak into the phone area at night sometimes and call her dad, who wasn't in the cult, but he thought she was making things up and over-exaggerating. I forget some of the other stuff. But I remember the point of the camp was to try and turn these girls into the cult's equivalent of a nun, and have them sent to a convent-type place once they were done with the camp. My co-worker only got out by financially convincing her dad that some ridiculous shit was going on and that she needed to get out of there. Number 10. The first thing to know is that when you're in a cult, especially if you were raised in the cult, it's all you know. My entire social universe was defined by the cult. They liked it that way. And people were discouraged from interacting with outsiders, except to bring them into the cult. Around the time that my parents left, there was a cult-wide scandal. The why and how isn't really important to this bit of the story, but one of the results was that the people were trying to make reforms on every local level. The organization was very hierarchical, and this was radical thinking. I decided to take some college courses in religion at my university, comparative religious studies, apologetics, exegesis, and so on. I also asked the campus leader out to lunch on a weekly basis, on my dial, to discuss the challenges that were happening and what I could do to help. I started to share some of what I was learning in my classes during our lunch. He seemed really positive and happy. He even had me prepare some sermons and the like. But that was only to my face. I guess I should have known better. Still, I was given some responsibilities, low-level stuff, week after week. And I would meet up with the leader and talk about things, but nothing changed. At the end of the semester, I dropped out of college to start my own business and started working absolutely insane hours. Looking back, I probably did that to get away from everything that was going on more than anything else. I cut back on attending so many functions, citing my new business as the reason. I upped my weekly contributions though, just so that it would look like I was serious and to keep my tithing on 10% of my gross income. I was surprised that few people complained to me, but kept wrapping myself up in work. The more time I spent away from the group, for the first time in my life mind you, the more I began to dread going back. I was pulling over 90 hours a week at that point, not counting my commute, and utterly drained whenever not working. Thanks to having to drive between my two retail locations, I had a lot of time to think. I kept thinking about the stuff I learned in those religious courses, and about how things weren't really changing. I just couldn't reconcile the behavior that I saw in the leadership, in private, and what they did in public. One evening, when driving home, it clicked that it wasn't just the leadership acting in that way. Everyone who was higher up in the organization all were successfully modeling the same behavior. Behavior that I didn't really like, or think that it was the way that people should be treated. Insomnia hit me hard. You know the opening scene of Fight Club? My life became like that. I was never really able to sleep, and never really awake. I was able to hit a point where I would have micro-sleep episodes through the day. I was emotionally bleeding out. Then the hallucinations started. Or more accurately, I began to dream while awake. Not good for business or your sanity. I tried to reach out to people, friends, that I had grown up with, and it was hard to even begin to explain what I was going through, and I was shocked cold when they stopped me and asked how my Bible studies were going, and told me that I should spend more time at cult events and with my discipler. I started journaling, something I highly recommend, and got in the habit of reading back over the last few weeks every so often. I noticed a pattern in who called me and what they were asking. I was always called several times to make sure I went to the midweek group meeting, which was when we tithed. It looked like people had actually made a schedule of who should call me and when. I decided to take a week off. Off work, off the group, off life. It was the first time I got real sleep in more than a year. My head was so much clearer when I woke up, and I realized how good I felt and how shitty it would feel to go back. It took me 6 months to fully leave. Bonus story. Back when I was younger, I got involved with a cult of sorts. It wasn't a freaky suicide cult like Jonestown or Heaven's Gate. Now, there was your typical charismatic leader who claimed to have supernatural powers and promised us gifts in the afterlife. But for the most part, he never did anything sketchy. Mostly, we just followed him as he gave sermons on the street. I don't know what exactly got into the cult. Times were different back then, and it didn't seem so crazy. Part of it was that a lot of my friends got into the group, and I just followed them. A much larger part of it was that there were always a ton of hot girls around, and at that point in my life, I didn't have much to hold on to, and he gave me something to believe in. It might have been a load of shit, but at that point in my life, it gave me a sense of purpose that I had always been looking for. Anyway, as the cult grew larger, we started to attract the attention of local law enforcement and politicians. They were wary of the power he was amassing in town, and they were looking for a way to bring him down. The group had gone into town to watch our leader give a sermon in the main marketplace. His sermons often got angry, but today's was different. Today he was violent and outraged. He spewed venomous rants about the evils of consumerism and the perversion of faith in society. The sermon reached a fevered pitch and the crowd erupted. They began to riot, they burned cars, looted stores, and just general destruction. The police showed up and arrested everyone on the scene. I got caught along with about a dozen or so people, but our leader escaped the scene before the cops arrived. The police knew he was there, and they wanted to bust him for it bad. They tried to get the followers they captured to testify, to say that he had started the riots. But no one would admit that he had been there. Well, almost no one. You see, I had a weakness, my mother. She was up to her eyes in debt, and she was constantly struggling to make her mortgage payments. My dad had died recently, and she barely had the strength to go out shopping for herself, let alone get a job at her age. They found my weakness. They told me that if I didn't testify, I would be in jail for at least 5 years, and at most 10. That was 5 to 10 years. My mum would go without any help. She would have to sell her house, the house my grandfather built, the house she was married in, the house she raised her kids in. I couldn't do that to my mother. They told me if I helped them, they would arrange for a reward if I gave up his whereabouts, so I agreed to testify. Now, they didn't know where he had been hiding, and I didn't either, but once they let me out, I would be able to find him again, and I could lead the police to him. But if I was the only one released, it would look suspicious, so they released everybody. Soon we found his new hiding place, and I relayed the address to the cops. The next few hours, while I waited for the police to show up, were the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. In the middle of our meal, they kick down the doors in SWAT gear and drag out our leader. The guilt must have shone on my face like a neon light, because as they dragged him out, he looked at me and he knew. It was one of the worst moments of my life. I was so burdened by the guilt, I entered into a depression. Every single person I knew hated me, and I had never been so alone in my life. I tried to make things right, but it was too late. The judge was so corrupt that he ended up getting the death penalty for some bullshit charges the cops made up. Watching his execution was brutal. Anyway, he came back from the dead 3 days later, and he was pissed.